and he had been for 8 years a professor at Harvard Law School, and of course back in college he'd started the first computerized dating service. So now since being on the bench, and he's still doing teaching as an adjunct at NYU, George Mason in Chicago, where he received his law degree from. He clerked for Judge McGowan and for Justice Thurgood Marshall on the Supreme Court. But that's only part of the story. Judge Ginsburg not only has a truly distinguished career as a judge, but he's also brought his knowledge across the globe, most recently discussing antitrust in Singapore and China. He's participated recently in Federalist Society programs in Europe, but while sharing his knowledge of both law and economics across the globe and with students in the United States, he's at the same time secured his reputation as one of the foremost jurists of his time with his work on the D.C. Circuit. And his work ranges well beyond antitrust, as you will hear shortly. I would add that part of the explanation of his enormous productivity is his intellectual curiosity and interest in a very broad array of topics. He's always fascinating to discuss almost any new development with. At the same time, consistent with this lecture series, he's deeply committed to the rule of law. I am honored to deliver the Barbara Olson Lecture, the Honorable Douglas Ginsburg.
Thank you, Gene. Well, it's a privilege to be here, and a special privilege for those of us, I think all of the lecturers so far, who knew Barbara Olson and who admired her intelligence, her vitality, energy, optimism. And for us, she will be forever young. Well, I woke up on the wrong side of the bed today. The coffee maker failed, so I just wanted to hold something unconstitutional. But the cases didn't lend themselves to that today, so instead I'm going to talk to you about the Unitary Executive and the non-delegation doctrine. And the remarks I'm going to make are based on an article that's will be out in some months, actually in a month or so, that was co-authored by Steve Menashe, who was chosen by the Federalist Society for the Olin Searle Fellowship, which he's taken to Georgetown Law Center this year. You'll be hearing a lot more from and about Steve in the coming years as he begins his academic career. Now, Americans have always mistrusted executive power, but only recently has the Unitary Executive emerged as the boogeyman of American politics. According to popular accounts, the idea of the Unitary Executive is one of presidential dictatorship that will destroy the balance of power shared by our three co-equal branches of government. These are all quotations from the popular press. Readers are led to conclude that the very notion of the Unitary Executive is a demonic modern invention of political conservatives, a marginal constitutional theory probably invented by Professor John Yoo at UC Berkeley, or a bald-faced power grab conjured up by the administration of George W. Bush, including, most ominously, Vice President Cheney. It's no surprise that the New York Times agreed with then-candidate Joe Biden's assessment that, quote, Mr. Cheney's theory of the Unitary Executive made him the most dangerous vice president we've had in American history, close quote. Now, in fact, the theory of the Unitary Executive has nothing to do with the extent of presidential power, but only with who is to exercise those powers, however broad, that are allocated by our Constitution to the executive. Its proponents seek not to evade the limitations of separated power, but rather insist, especially when dealing with the other branches, that the president alone is responsible for the actions of the executive branch. The idea seems ominous today only because so many functions that have been allocated to the now fragmented executive, that reuniting them under presidential leadership seems both to enhance presidential authority unimaginably and to create unmanageable administrative structures. I hope no one in this room will be surprised to hear that Dick Cheney did not originate the idea that the executive power should be united under presidential control, or maybe vice presidential control. That was part of the original constitutional design. That, in fact, providing for a unitary executive responded to the fear, seldom heard today, I'm afraid, that the Congress would become tyrannical. In Federalist number 51, Madison wrote, "In Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates." Close quote. Now, his remedy for this tendency toward domination was to divide the legislative into into different chambers, while the executive was to remain unitary so it would not be overmatched in its battles with the legislature. He explained, as the weight of the legislative authority requires that it should be thus divided, the two chambers, the weakness of the executive may require that it should be fortified. Today, Madison's warning seems quaint. Having seen the socially transformative power of the courts, many understandably scoff at Hamilton's characterization of the judiciary as the least dangerous branch. Editorialists, not surprisingly, conclude that the executive is the most powerful branch and the legislative weak by comparison. And against this newly received wisdom, I suggest that Madison was right and the modern inversion is mistaken. The unitary executive has fallen into ill repute and apparent obsolescence, not because of an executive bent upon autocracy, but because of a legislature freed from the constraints of the separation of powers. I start with the simple reminder that the framers of our Constitution did not establish a parliamentary system. The president is not selected by the Congress. The founders sought to establish a president who was more than an agent of the legislature, as was the prime minister under the historic British Constitution. Quoting Federalist 51 again, "In order to lay a due foundation for that separate and distinct exercise of the different powers of government, it is evident that each department should have a will of its own, and consequently should be so constituted that the members of each should have as little agency as possible in the appointment of the members of the others." The theory of the unitary executive focuses upon the extent to which Article 2, Section 1, Clause 1 of the Constitution, the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America, protects the President's authority to appoint, direct, and remove officers within the executive branch. Complementing this positive grant of authority is the understanding that the other branches would be confined to their own spheres. And a necessary corollary of the unitary executive finds expression in the non-delegation doctrine, the idea that the Congress cannot delegate its lawmaking powers to the executive or the judiciary. The demise of that doctrine has allowed the Congress both to augment and to fragment the executive. By establishing agencies within the executive tasked with making policy pursuant to broad mandates from the Congress, agencies that effectively exercise legislative power through rulemaking. The non-delegation doctrine was once recognized as a foundational principle of the separation of powers. Its roots go back to John Locke, who wrote, "The power of the legislative being only to make laws and not to make legislators, the legislative can have no power to transfer their authority of making laws and place it in other hands." Locke developed the non-delegation doctrine out of an elementary maxim of the law of agency. Delegata potestas non potest delegari. Delegated powers cannot be further delegated. Once the people had delegated the lawmaking power to the legislature, it could pass no farther, lest it elude the people's oversight. Chief Justice Taft recognized the non-delegation doctrine as a fixture of American constitutional law. In J.W. Hampton, the Supreme Court considered whether the Congress may delegate to the President the authority to alter duties imposed by the Tariff Act of 1922. American courts, especially state courts, had been grappling with the reach of the non-delegation doctrine since the beginning of the Republic. Chief Justice Taft drew upon their work, and the cases he cites demonstrate how well understood was the importance of the non-delegation doctrine to the American constitutional system. I'm going to invoke just a couple of the cases. There are many, I assure you. In 1852, the Supreme Court of Ohio had considered whether the state legislature could require county commissioners, upon a referendum of the public, to subscribe to the capital stock of a private company established to build a new railroad and to issue bonds in payment. The court started from first principles. That the General Assembly cannot surrender any portion of the legislative authority with which it is invested, or otherwise it's exercised by any other person, or authorized, it's exercised by any other person or body, is a proposition too clear for argument and is denied by no one. This inability arises no less from the general principle applicable to every delegated power requiring knowledge, discretion, and rectitude in its exercise than from the positive provisions of the Constitution itself.